Vladimir Putin was visiting Viktor Lukashenko of Belarus to talk about, in particular, Oreshnik missiles, which are going to be deployed and stationed in Belarus. And this is what he had to say. Hold on, no, this is not the right one. This is what he had to say regarding this that has the collective West in somewhat of a major state of alarm. Here's what he said.
The first thing I wanted to say in this connection, we have already manufactured the first serial production Oreshnik missile complex, and it's already been fielded.
The Oreshnik missile is now mass produced, given the test that occurred last year and how much that frightened the West and the power of that missile. That has caused some great panic. But then a Russian lawmaker had this to say in particular about the nuclear submarine threat. Viktor Berletic responded to Donald Trump's nuclear submarine threat, the movement of nuclear submarines to appropriate regions, by saying there are significantly more of our nuclear submarines in the world's oceans, and they have the strongest and most powerful weapons. This is why Trump's 2 boats, let them float. They have been at gunpoint for quite a long time. Very strong words. I mean, this moment is very reminiscent of the Cold War. It's a very kind of new Cold War-like moment where we have Russia gearing up in a very big way, Brian, for this larger conflict. And Oreshniks are now a part of this. Many people have said, well, this isn't a direct threat. It doesn't really mean much. It doesn't mean Oreshniks are going to be used, but they're available. And that's a big deal for a country like Russia, which is under significant threat right now. What's your thoughts?
Well, this is Russia. Russia has to demonstrate significant deterrence against the United States and its client states, because if they don't, we can see the U.S. will just continue taking and taking and taking. They do this salami slice strategy where they just take just a tiny bit each time so that it doesn't seem like a big deal, but over time it starts to add up. They've been doing the exact same thing to Iran in the Middle East, and they've done the exact same thing to China in the Asia Pacific. And as a matter of fact, we've already seen the conflict with Iran culminate in open war. And this is exactly how these other conflicts are going to unfold. And the United States honestly believes that eventually it could fight a war against these countries directly. It suspects that it can do this without it escalating to nuclear warfare, or they believe somehow it would be limited nuclear war. And they feel, and maybe there is some truth to this, they're on the other side of the planet. They have oceans between them and everybody else. And so when they are causing all of this murder, mayhem, death, and destruction from one side of Eurasia to the other, they're destroying everything there. And the United States remains untouched on the other side of the planet. The U.S. has its forces spanning the globe, and they're able to project this military power in ways that both Russia and China cannot. Of course, Iran most certainly cannot. And so this does give them an advantage. They see that over time, the trajectory of the rise of multipolarism, the fading of US-led unipolarism, they know that this opportunity isn't going to last forever, so they're trying to take advantage of it now while it lasts. Now, you were talking about the Oreshnik and how these weapons and other weapons have been stationed in Belarus. And what Russia is basically doing is extending protection and essentially almost integrating Belarus into the Russian Federation. Because if they don't do this, the U.S. is going to use its other super weapon that a lot of people don't really seem to talk about or notice that much. And that is America's ability to infiltrate and politically capture a targeted nation. This is what they did to Ukraine, which caused this war in the first place, which short-circuited the Ukrainian people's ability to pursue their own best interests and to essentially commit national suicide. And they openly tried to do this to Belarus many times over the past 2 or 3 decades. Since the end of the Cold War, essentially. They are doing this here in the Asia-Pacific region. They've already politically captured Europe. The European Union is essentially an American project, an extension of American policy. People always ask, why is Europe doing this? They're destroying their own economy. Why are they doing this? Because the people in power do not represent or reflect the interest of Europe. They reflect the interest of Washington, who put them there in power. They want to create the same dynamics here in the Asia Pacific region, and they've done this in the Middle East to a great degree. They have all kinds of proxies there who are pursuing war and proxy war against their own best interest to serve American hegemony worldwide. So this is the threat that Russia, China, and Iran are faced with, and I would say multipolarism as a whole. And the response to this has to be full spectrum, because the U.S. is waging full spectrum war against them.
Not only did this Russian lawmaker say straight up that we have our weapons pointed at you, we have our submarines pointed at you, they're more effective. They've been there for quite a long time. But when it comes to the Oreshnik, I mean, this is quite a powerful weapon. And while, yes, the United States, to Brian's point, it has the will. It wants to expand. It wants to move. There's a Russia and China, these countries, they don't want to fight wars of aggression. So what do you make of the overall situation and Russia's response in this context?
Well, once again, I think it's important to highlight that Russia has been very, very measured throughout the war. But the U.S. is pushing the buttons, and they're trying to go as far as they can. So, absolutely, Russians don't want to fight, just like the Chinese don't want to fight. They don't want a war. But they're also signaling that if we need to go up the threshold, if we need to go up the escalation ladder, we will. And the Oreshnik is a very interesting weapon, because it is a non-nuclear strategic weapon. That is, it's a weapon that has the force and the destructive capacity of a nuclear weapon, but it is non-nuclear. It works purely from the kinetic energy that it generates in its incredibly rapid hypersonic flight. The U.S. has nothing that can deal with that can challenge that. And even if we were to remove Oreshniks from the picture, we've also seen that the U.S. Missile shield, the U.S. capacity to defend itself, has been tested. It's been thoroughly tested in the recent Israel-Iran war, the 12-day war, and it has been found completely lacking. Let's think about what happened between, in the exchange between Iran and Israel. Well, True Promise 3 was the largest ballistic missile launch in history, 550 missiles. We don't know exactly how many hit, but we know that the battle damage was enough that Israel had to tap out, and that it also is hiding the battle damage. This is currently censored. So whatever happened, we know that it was significant. In this process, we also know that the U.S. threw everything they had against Iran's missile capacity. That is, they brought in Patriots from other theaters. In fact, they said it was the most intense Patriot engagement in the history of the weapon. They brought in the THAAD system. The Israelis themselves had David's Sling Arrow 2 and 3, and the Iron Dome. So multiple layers of defense systems, and the Russians were able to demolish these with what looked to be largely conventional ballistic missiles. So that sends a very, very strong message to the United States. You no longer have escalation dominance. You no longer have a missile shield. You no longer have impunity in attacking countries with standoff weapons, as that they have always had. And if you think of that equation, and then on top of that, you add hypersonics like the Oreshnik, which, as I said, are strategic non-nuclear weapons, then I think that the United States, if it were to think carefully, would say, we need to sue for peace right away. But it's not doing that. It only knows one thing, which is to escalate and to move forward. It doesn't have a reverse gear. It doesn't even have, the neutral, the idle gear is only so that it can go forward again. And so this is a very, very dangerous moment. And we have to understand that, as Brian said, the US will do several other things. It's waging full spectrum war. So as conventional war becomes less and less viable, they will do, the kind of dirty wars, the small wars, the regime change, color revolution operations, creating essentially chaos around the world and certainly all around Asia. And then the other thing that, we know is being prepared are tactical nukes, which Elbridge Colby has been talking about for at least a decade. And then we also know that the information warfare will continue to accelerate. The key strength that the United States has above and beyond any other skill and capacity is its capacity to mystify, indoctrinate, and to wage information war. So once again, we should expect an even greater level of propaganda and indoctrination.
The United States can't really catch up to Russia. It's trying, but what's such an interesting contradiction for the United States at this time when it comes to developments like the Oreshnik is that it has to, its doctrine has been win wars, quote unquote, quickly, right? Full spectrum dominance and aggression, take out the enemy, quote unquote, as fast as possible, regime change as fast as possible. That is victory. Now with Russia, though, there's a commitment to a long war because that was never really in the cards. And it's a dangerous contradiction when you both have this need to keep the conflict going on the part of the United States, as well as the fact that Russia is going to continue onward, developing its own industrial base, leading to possibly this parallel process between the two of endless conflict. And that seems to be the only choice the U.S. has and is very committed to doing this.
I'd be very careful about underestimating the United States. No, they do not have the industrial power to wage a protracted war of attrition with Russia or China, or even with Iran. We saw the trouble they had in that conflict, as KJ was just pointing out. The problem is the United States fully understands this. They understand that this is a weakness. It's inherent in the system that represents U.S. special interests, this pursuit of power and profit over purpose, the inability to create the state-owned enterprises that would actually facilitate the military power required to seize power, keep power by force, only by force. But see, the United States has cultivated all of these other options. They have tremendous economic power. They're still wielding. I just watched the United States coerce multiple nations in ASEAN, here in Southeast Asia, into these, I wouldn't even call them trade deals. It was trade concessions and trade coercion. And they're able to do this because of their economic power and all the other non-military instruments of power that the U.S. has perfected over the last several decades. And I keep going back to this ability of the U.S. to infiltrate a country politically in terms of seizing its information space, education, rigging the political system if it's a nation that has a Western style, quote unquote, democracy. This is a system the U.S. and the British imposed on many of these countries outside of the West, specifically because it allows them to come in, interfere in that system, and create the results each and every single time an election takes place that favors them and their interests at the cost of the interest of the actual country holding these so-called elections. And the United States still has tremendous power over many nations, has outright politically captured all of Europe, Japan, South Korea. It has taken the island province of Taiwan, has politically captured that. This is part of China, but it has been politically captured by the United States. And the United States is working its way into nations where it has varying levels of success here in Southeast Asia. There was this border conflict between Thailand and Cambodia. The dynamics there were specifically because the U.S. has influence pretty much over the entire Cambodian government. It's a one-party, single-family government, and they have pivoted hard back toward the United States over the last year or so. And they also have politically captured the political system, information space, and education system here in Thailand. And there is currently a U.S.-backed client regime in power here. And so this is how they're able to get these countries to make concessions, to make agreements, to do things, to pursue policies that serve U.S. interests at their own expense, and create these dilemmas for nations like Russia, Iran, and China. These nations are surrounding, these nations are located along their peripheries. This is a super weapon the U.S. has and uses, and this is how it is responding to the reality that it cannot fight an all-out war against Russia and China directly, but it has other ways of pursuing this conflict. I just want to remind people that the whole conflict in Ukraine was never about defeating Russia. It was about extending Russia. There's literally a paper titled "Extending Russia" by the Rand Corporation, published in 2019, that says we want this conflict. We are going to throw Ukraine into this conflict. We know Ukraine will be destroyed, but it will raise the cost for Russia. It will overextend Russia. It will tie up Russia. And this is where strategic sequencing comes in place. If the U.S. just pivoted from Russia to Iran or to China, and it did not create this quagmire to suck Russia into Ukraine, Russia could just pivot and take all of its resources and support Iran or to support China. But because the U.S. has created these dilemmas for Russia and Ukraine, for Iran in across the entire Middle East, and for China in terms of Taiwan and Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, it has locked all of these countries in place. And this is what will allow them to attack and defeat in detail all three of these pillars of multipolarism.
Putin alluded to this in his presser with Viktor Lukashenko of Belarus. This is what he said. I'll put it on mute again because it's in Russian. With caption, in the modern world, this has always been important, but today especially, sovereignty plays a particularly key role, one might say, including for economic development. It was clear that the European Union did not have that much sovereignty. Today, it has become obvious that it does not exist at all. And this is immediately followed in the critical situation and economic losses that follow. Russia, China, these countries are championing sovereignty very hard, much to Brian's assessment. But your reaction to all of this?
Well, I think, we've had this discussion before. As Brian says, the US's super weapon is information war. It dominates information space and mental space. And it does this because it has had centuries of practice in essentially propaganda. It's marketing, it's propaganda, it's also, religious doctrine. All of these things come together in a way that is very, very powerful, that allows them to control and have literally monopoly control over information space. And they also control the hardware as well that allows the access or the dissemination of information. So that is a very, very tough nut to crack. But specifically regarding, the notion of sovereignty, the United States regards any country that asserts its sovereignty as authoritarian. So, for example, China is authoritarian because it upholds its sovereignty. Now, technically, the world system is supposed to be made up of sovereign states. So this is actually, goes back to the Treaty of Westphalia. It's at least 4 centuries old. And certainly it was enshrined in the UN and certainly in the Bandung Principles of sovereignty and non-interference. But all of that has been thrown out the window if it was ever, anything more than window dressing. Specifically in the early 2000s, the US, came forth with a doctrine where they said that sovereignty is contingent. What is it contingent on? Well, they said it's contingent on good governance and human rights. What they really mean is it's contingent on whether you are a good vassal, whether you allow yourselves to be subjugated to the hegemon. And so the US has constructed this entire, vocabulary with which it captures, the global system. As I said, operations mean war, defense means offense, security means hegemony. So anytime the US talks about ensuring security, what they really are talking about is ensuring US hegemony. Anytime they say deter, for example, deter China, what they're really talking about is provoking China. And certainly this notion of sovereignty has been so wiped clean of its original sense because the US has this hegemonic ambition to control all the countries of the world. Now that is slipping away. Clearly, Russia, China, Iran are sovereign states, and as are more and more countries of the global south. But still, the U.S. Ability, the power to compel and to coerce other countries is significant. And as Brian pointed out, we saw this in the ways that they all kind of peeled off and capitulated one by one to Trump's tariffs. I mean, just one example is South Korea, which has agreed to 15% tariffs and $450 billion worth of investment and purchases, of which $350 billion South Korea is committed to invest in the United States. Now, the tricky thing here is that that's about all of South Korea's foreign exchange reserves. In other words, they're going to empty their pockets in order to please or to appease the hegemon. That said, I don't want us to think that everything, is lost and that, it's just one-sided game. Once again, if you look at Korea recently got rid of the U.S. quisling, Yoon Suk-yeol. He was literally, impeached, kicked out. And now they have, a very much more progressive leader who is trying his best, A, not to get couped, and B, to put up some kind of resistance against the empire. If you look at the discussions around geostrategic maneuvering in East Asia, Korea is more and more dropped. The ambitions for Korea seem to be more diminished, and the role of Japan is much more emphasized or accelerated. Most recently, U.S. discussions around, using nuclear weapons with Japan. Taiwan, of course, is, it is the spear point of U.S. ambitions in East Asia. But once again, very recently, they tried to initiate a legislative coup. They were going to recall all the opposition lawmakers who were opposed to their escalation to war. And they were actually thoroughly trounced at the ballot box, which shows that there's considerable resistance on the ground. Right now, the U.S. quisling DPP Taiwan Party is reeling, as is the United States itself, because things have not gone according to plan. And of course, Japan has been blowing hot and cold. Ishiba has been going along with the Shinzo Abe agenda, which is, rapid remilitarization. But he has also been a little bit of a loose cannon. He said in the past that, yes, we want to support the United States. We're happy to have U.S. bases on our territory. But as a sovereign state, in terms of reciprocity, we would also like to place Japanese military bases on U.S. sovereign territory. That did not go over well, and it looks like he's going to be, pushed out. But there are contradictions inside the system, and those are the things that we have to look for. We have to look at where the contradictions are, see where there are crevices, and then we have to, expand and allow those contradictions to be visible and present.
For the United States, as its empire really loses the capacity to arrest the development of something like multipolarity, the more desperate it becomes. And the more desperate it becomes, yes, there's a lot of weakness and decline there. But when an empire is backed into a corner, it lashes out as much and as hard as it can. And that's what it is doing now. And that's why, Brian, to your point, that not only has the United States has totally come, its foreign policy has totally come to the conclusion that there is no real quote unquote defeat of Russia beyond continuing this conflict as long as possible, and is hoping and seeing if that opens up opportunities in the future that maybe we can't foresee that allows them to get what they want, which is, of course, the dismemberment of Russia.
Yes, I just want to remind people that because Russia was tied up in Ukraine, still is tied up in Ukraine, the United States was able to finally and fully dismember Syria. And then because that was a prerequisite for all-out war on Iran, advance that agenda toward actual war with Iran, which is still ongoing. It's paused. The outright fighting is paused. Everyone on all sides is getting ready for the next round. That is far from finished there. And I want to point out, yes, China has tremendous military power. It continues to grow. But I want to remind people that the United States, again, has this global spanning military, and the plans, the policies that they are putting into place and what they are actually physically preparing for is not to fight China and defeat it on its own territory or along its shores. It wants to create a conflict, raise the cost for China, and then also use any conflict as an excuse to cut off Chinese maritime shipping worldwide. They are putting the pieces into place to do this. And Danny, you were talking about this CSIS war game. I don't know if you mentioned it during the show, but before we went live, you were talking about CSIS, one of these corporate-funded think tanks. They were talking about wargaming, a Chinese blockade of their own island province of Taiwan, and all the different things that could happen. And one of the outcomes was the U.S. able to use that as a pretext to isolate China diplomatically, politically, economically. And that is, they will provoke this war. Whether they win it or not doesn't matter. They will use that as the pretext to cut Chinese maritime shipping, to isolate China in all of the ways that it has tried to isolate Russia. And I see people in the comment section confused about whether I'm saying the U.S. will win or not. I'm not saying that they're going to win or not win. I'm just saying people should not underestimate them. They are extremely dangerous. And what they lack in military industrial production, they more than make up for in political meddling, subversion, and political capture.
Yeah, and I would say winning is really not the question for the U.S. foreign policy establishment anymore, because it's trying to hold on to an empire. And in many ways, China and Russia have won in so many critical categories. Ryan, you mentioned earlier Russia's industrial military production. It's won that. I mean, it's done. That's happened. If the United States can prolong this long enough, maybe they can keep Ukraine and go on to other fronts like Moldova or whatever, and find ways to militarily and politically encircle Russia. But just on the pure facts of military industrial production, Russia has won that, and China economically has already won that. It's really a matter of other than maybe pure GDP terms, but it's really a matter of, for the United States, how can it stop that? And that's what it will do at all costs, maybe to the biggest cost, leading to the biggest cost, which is nuclear conflict, which Donald Trump is openly talking about as if it's a joke, and that is no joke.